So I'd like to welcome all of y'all. My name is Chuck Black. I use he, him pronouns, and I oversee our voter-friendly campus program. The voter-friendly campus program is a national designation program between the Fair Election Center and NASPA. We recognize campuses for their commitment to student voting. So I did put a prompt in the chat, and I would ask that all of you put that prompt in. But just to get started, a bit about voter friendly campus, the Fair Election Center campus vote project, and a few other key voter friendly campus announcements. As you can notice, we just did a brand new re rebrand. If you have not been to the Voter Friendly Campus website, I certainly encourage you to check it out. I'll drop the link into the chat. And the Fair Elections Center also completely rebranded. So this is our new logo, new colors, very exciting times. For those of you who are in the Voter Friendly Campus program, you should be receiving feedback very soon on your action plan. If you have not submitted it, there is still certainly time. I'll drop in. You can submit your plan here if you have not. And if you need extra time or have any questions, that is the best way to contact us. And as Mike said, we are still the same org, same mission, just a brand new look. So the Fair Election Center, we are national, we are nonpartisan, and we really focus on voting rights, and election reform. The Fair Election Center houses the Campus Vote Project, who is a national nonpartisan nonprofit that really focuses on institutionalizing student voting. We currently partner with over 300 campuses across the country. We have staff on the ground in 13 states. And we're just we are growing, and as you can imagine, it's a super busy year. As part of the Voter Friendly Campus program, every year, and not every year, every month, we have a webinar on different topics. And this is, I think, a very important webinar as we go through some of the changes to voting law. But first, before I pass it over to our two main speakers, I just wanted to share that the Fair Election Center, we provide educational resources on our website and in person through state summits. We have guides on our website that go through different voting laws and different things that you need to know for all 50 states and Washington. Washington, D.C. should also be a state, but that's a different webinar for a different time. We have paid student fellows on campuses all across the country. And as I said, we continue to grow. But at the core of our work, we train our students, we train our staff to really understand election law on the ground. As we know, the laws can really vary campus to campus. I mean, not campus, state to state. So it's very important that our students and our staff know about those changes. So to get us started with this important conversation, one of our colleagues at NASPA, Diana, will take it away.
Thanks so much, Chuck. It's lovely to be here. It feels like a Monday. And so I'm trying just with my voice to sound amped and energetic, even if I don't necessarily feel that way. I know that we are in very unprecedented times, and I'm really excited to be here today to talk about state-based voting legislation. Um, so, a little bit about me. My background is in policy and also in social work. I really value empathy kind of centered spaces. And so please feel free throughout kind of our presentation that I've been collaborating on with Mike to jump in, unmute, ask questions, whatever strikes your fancy throughout the presentation today. So I've been at NASPA for about 8 years, and I was brought in originally to help support policy analysis work that we were trying to start doing at the state-based level. And a big reason why we were trying to do that was because in 2016, there was legislation that was enacted in Indiana, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act at the time, that was very discriminatory towards LGBTQ folks. And we had a conference in Indianapolis in 2016. And we had a lot of folks kind of within the NASPA student affairs space who attended that conference actually kind of take part in their own personal right to engage civically and practice their nonpartisan political engagement around this issue. And so NASPA decided to respond by bringing on somebody so that we could be more aware of what's actually going on at the state level. And I've been really happy throughout my time here at NASPA to, in the last several years, work with the Campus Vote Project more. My supervisor, Dr. Jill Dunlap, who's on the call as well, kind of leads our civic engagement portfolio at NASPA. And has been really thoughtful in bringing other kind of staff into the conversation. So super happy to be here, but enough about me. So NASPA, so moving on to the next slide, I just wanted to share a little bit about NASPA's Research and Policy Institute. NASPA actually has a policy and research kind of arm where we do original research. We also do policy analysis work that I'm a part of. We develop tools, participate in webinars like this one, and we do all of this with the goal of really advancing higher education equity and student success. Moving forward, the approach that I am bringing to the conversation today on the next slide is an approach that's very centered on a policy analysis approach to higher education advocacy. And I wanted to kind of found the conversation in this today from the NASPA side because we know that issues have been conflated recently as being partisan in a lot of ways, issues related to voting rights, related to equity and inclusion, related to mental health, related to all of these various factors that we think are really important elements of what comprise student success and impact the experience of our student affairs professionals supporting students on campuses. And so by bringing a policy analysis approach to this conversation today, I am hoping to help us assess the current political climate, analyze relevant legislation. We're not going to be doing this today, but what we support is helping folks kind of identify institutional constraints that can kind of get in the way of implementing changes in state law on campuses, and finally to develop kind of tailored strategies through asset-based approaches to find something that can actually work to support student success. So with all of that being said, this is another kind of foundational slide here that I wanted to share. It kind of at the top, I said we're in these unprecedented times. And the reason why I mentioned that is because of obviously all of these various things that are happening in our political climate, but also we're hearing, more and more so from our members that there are elements related to political interference in higher education that are impacting the student experience. And so this was a survey that we conducted with 174 NASPA members, many of who are interested in policy and advocacy related work. Who identified kind of major issues, that policy issues that they believe to be impacting students on the ground. 56.3% identified financial aid and college affordability as a top policy issue. 50.6% pointed towards student mental health. 36.8% recognized student basic needs. But 33.3% acknowledged, as I mentioned, this issue related to political interference in higher education, while only 9.8% referenced voting rights and civic engagement as a policy issue relevant to the student experience. So we know that one of the goals of civic engagement campus initiatives is to, of course, promote nonpartisan political engagement among students. And it's very possible that these efforts could work to mitigate some of these impacts of what we've seen, or folks, maybe identifying as this political interference, which is why I wanted to kind of bring that forward. And hopefully this can give you a sense of, from the student affairs practitioner lens, kind of like what we are thinking about at NASPA, and the connections that we're thinking about with state-based voting rights and voting access to intersections with student success. So all of that being said, while we are kind of trying to continually promote nonpartisan political engagement at NASPA, we also, of course, point folks to recent developments by the Department of Education to reaffirm what has been written in the Higher Education Act for decades around how institutions must make voter registration forms widely available to students, and more recently, the issuance of this guidance on federal work-study funds that FWS funds can include supporting broad-based get-out-the-vote activities. These aren't seen as partisan activities, voter registration, serving as a poll worker, etc. And Mike is going to go into greater detail on federal work-study in a little bit. So to further ground the conversation and assess kind of where we're at, that we recognize that we are just in a moment of time today, I really like to go into the history of any issue that I'm covering. As I mentioned before, well, maybe I didn't mention this. At NASPA, we are at any given time, because we are a generalist association, we have 15,000 individual members and around 1,400 institutional members. At any given time, we are covering like 7 to 10 different issue areas at the state level. And so when I give kind of educational presentations on topical issues, I always like to include, and I'm putting a link in the chat, which goes into kind of the state-based issues that we're currently looking at ASPA. But I like to give kind of a background of the history of that kind of brought us here to this day. And I think that's particularly important for voting law legislation on the state side, because there have been so many shifts over time, delegating this, from the state-based level to then establishing more federal level protections, and then now seeing again a ton of variation in the state level, which we're also seeing with many different issues, including free speech, and the DEI related legislation, mental health legislation, tons of variations happening right now in the states. So, okay, so I'm going to try to go through the history kind of quickly. I have tons of notes written here, so I'm going to try to like keep it somewhat short. So obviously we know that our Constitution was ratified. This largely left voting regulations to individual states. And then this isn't in this timeline here, but the 14th Amendment, which was ratified in 1868, really started to lay that foundational floor of providing federal protection of individual rights against the states. The 15th Amendment prohibited voting discrimination based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. 19th Amendment, women have the right to vote. This leads up to movement building, of course, as a part of the civil rights movement, and numerous civic engagement efforts that lead to the enactment, the historical enactment that we all know of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, which was signed by President Lyndon B. Johnson at the time. And the key provisions here that are important in my grounding of the issue, and that I know that most of the folks on this call already know this information, but I still feel like it's useful, were Section 4B, right, which established a formula to identify areas with histories of voting discrimination, and also Section 5, which required these areas to obtain federal preclearance before changing voting laws, ensuring no discriminatory practices could be limited and implemented. And VRA, was super duper successful. And we'll, in the next slide, kind of talk about some of the changes that we've seen in terms of litigation that have led to it being largely dismantled. But also very important here was 1971, the passage of the 26th Amendment, which lowered the voting age to 18. From 21 to 18. This has been a really integral amendment for recent litigation that pertains to students. We saw in 1993 the National Voter Registration Act, which simplified voter registration by allowing folks to register when applying for their driver's licenses or public assistance and through mail-in forms, making it start to become easier for students to register. And the Help America Vote Act, which was enacted in 2002, mandated changes to improve voting systems and voting access. And then we saw, in 2020, a ton of changes related to mail-in and absentee voting in connection with the COVID-19 pandemic. So moving on to the next slide to give some highlights of litigation. The first case that I'll mention is Sim v. United States. This was a case dating back in 1979 in Waller County, Texas, which was targeting a historically Black university and dealt with residency requirements, where at the time there was a special questionnaire that students had to fill out in order to determine their residency status. And the Supreme Court decision that came out of this case affirmed the decision by the district court at the time, which ruled that the additional requirements were discriminatory and did violate the constitutional rights of students. Very important case. Another very important case, of course, was Shelby County v. Holder, where we saw the dismantling of the Voting Rights Act. And I'm sure you've seen the articles. I see them all the time, especially last year where we had kind of our 10-year anniversary of the Shelby County decision, where there's been just a ton of litigation that has resulted from the decision that was made back then in 2013 in this case, where the argument was that Shelby County, Alabama, argued that the preclearance requirements of the VRA were outdated and unconstitutional. It seems like that was a very questionable argument to come to, and they contended that the formula in Section 4B no longer reflected current voting conditions and unfairly subjected certain jurisdictions to federal oversight based on historical data. So this case went to the Supreme Court, and a 5-4 decision ruled that Section 4B of the VRA was unconstitutional. You've probably seen the majority opinion by Justice John Roberts at the time, which stated that the coverage formula was based on decades-old data and eradicated practices. Unfortunately, however, we have seen many impacts that have resulted in restrictive state-based legislation and state-based gerrymandering, and a ton of changes that have happened since this decision was made. Moving on, because I know that folks on this call are familiar. Another case that I like to think about is a ballot amendment challenge from 2018 that impacted early voting sites. This was the case of the League of Women Voters, involving the League of Women Voters in Florida, and involved the 26th Amendment. So this case was focused on, like I said, was a ballot amendment challenge, but an outcome of this case found that the state's policy created unnecessary barriers for young voters, according to the 26th Amendment, which prohibits age discrimination in voting, as I mentioned initially. And the court issued a preliminary injunction to block the enforcement of this restriction, ensuring better access to early voting for students at this time. Two final cases that I'll just mention very briefly is that of Common Cause Indiana v. Lawson. So Mike's going to be talking about voter purge laws. And this was a case involving those where they found that Indiana's purge procedures violated the National Voter Registration Act. It's important for us to talk about voter purge legislation in connection with a conversation related to student voting, because students are disproportionately impacted by purge laws. And this did find this decision, the decision that escalated to the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, did find that removing voters based on cross-check data without direct notification was inconsistent with the National Voter Registration Act. And then finally, in 2020, Texas Democratic Party v. Abbott is a case I like to highlight, and there's obviously tons of litigation that isn't mentioned here. But I like to highlight it because it had to do with addressing limitations imposed by Texas on voting by mail during the COVID-19 pandemic. And this case ultimately held that Texas's age distinction based on its absentee ballot eligibility rules survives likely survives constitutional scrutiny. And the court acknowledged that the statute discriminates based on age, but concluded that these distinctions were justified under the law. And so with that, I'll move on to the next slide, which has kind of brought us finally to our current state legislative landscape. This picture here was pulled from Multi-State. It is current as of today. There are tons of state legislative session trackers that are for free online. I like the one with National Conference of State Legislatures. But most states are not currently in session at this time. This is sort of a foundational slide laying out kind of distinctions between federal law and state law, where, because of these recent Supreme Court cases that have really, in terms of the higher education space, rolled back some of the protections to federal legislation, such as the race-conscious admissions decision a few years back, or last year. Oh my gosh, what is time anymore? We're starting to see a ton of variation at the state level, and state law is subservient to federal law and explicit conflict, and trumps local law and explicit conflict. And in terms of rights to the people, state law that affords greater rights to residents does take precedent. But in our current landscape, our current state voting landscape, which is on the next slide, we've seen just in 2024, we haven't seen as much activity in terms of actually enacted state legislation relating to voting access in what I've tracked. And I use a couple methods of tracking. I personally track legislation through a legislative tracking software called Fiscal Note. And then I also, of course, consult with all of the other kind of trackers out there and the folks that are able to dedicate resources beyond what we can at NASPA to do legislative tracking. So the Voting Rights Lab has very detailed legislative tracking, and all of their data is open to the public. You can create an account with them and sign up for their newsletter, and they're really great. So of what I have tracked, so we saw over this past cycle 723 bills. I know I said there weren't that many, but I meant in terms of like bills that have actually been enacted. We saw 723 bills proposed to improve voting access, and only 236 that would restrict access. And I mentioned this ratio to kind of show that even though oftentimes when we're talking about state-based voting rights legislation, we're focusing on legislation that creates restrictions, and we are in this presentation as well. But there are far more bills that have been proposed that actually, expand or propose to expand voting access. We saw 11 states enact 14 laws expanding access, focusing on absentee voting, early voting, voting rights for individuals with disabilities. If you're interested in a list of the actual legislation, I'm happy to send that along. And then we saw between January 1st and June 6th, at least 8 states passed 9 restrictive voting laws. I've seen over the past, like since June 6th, I've seen there are a couple that this list I think didn't capture that have been signed into law since then. Alabama and Idaho enacted some of the most significant restrictions, and these laws continue to be a part of a broader trend of restrictive measures following the 2020 election. So even though in 2024, we only saw 8 states enact restrictive voting laws. Since 2020, we've seen kind of efforts to kind of chip away at certain areas, particularly related to early voting and absentee voting. And on the next slide, I've kind of like highlighted some of the major trends from the past several years. So when we're talking about restrictive state legislative trends relating to voting laws that impact students, we're thinking about voter ID laws, states that could restrict, not just create restrictions related to requiring the use of voter ID laws, but also limiting what kinds of photo IDs would work, where in some states a student ID is not always acceptable. Early voting restrictions, though largely since 2020, we've seen expansions to early voting and absentee and mail-in voting. So this presidential election that we have coming up is one of it's the most accessible presidential election that we've seen in terms of access to voting. So it's important to be clear about that, even while we're talking about these restrictions. Mail-in ballot limitations, voter roll purges. This has been a big one in connection also with kind of legislation targeting non-citizen voters that are the language though is very similar to voter purge legislation. Stricter voter registration requirements and polling place changes. In terms of expansive legislation, which is on the next, oh, sorry, I'm like 2 slides past this now. Sorry, Chuck. I was in pain. Okay, so in terms of expansive voter legislation, we're seeing trends around automatic voter registration, early voting, mail-in ballot access, and same-day voter registration. So I'm going to stop there. Again, if folks are interested in learning more about specifics, I am happy to, I said we use this legislative tracking software, and ASPA, I'm happy to look up something for you. I'm also happy to share with you information that we have on specific state-based legislation over the past year. But with that, I will pass it to Mike, who is going to kind of take us back to what we were talking about earlier when I was kind of grounding the conversation in the Higher Education Act and the recent federal work study guidance.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just think that's so important to share, and I'm going to dig into it. But I would say too, one of the things we saw is that in 2020, we saw the largest voter turnout in the history of the country, even during a global pandemic. And like the election laws changed so rapidly, like the work that I do, the voting rights folks do, that Diana has done in the last several years, there are more changes, it feels like, every year in election laws in the last couple of years than happened in like the first 10, 15 years that I was doing this work. We've just seen like a massive shift in this, so I don't want to lose sight of that. So we saw huge turnout, major changes to election laws, the most litigated election in history, the most reviewed election we've had in quite some time, without ever finding any proof of substantial fraud. And I think what happened is we saw a bunch of states look around and say, when we met voters where they were at, when we made these expansive things to make it easier for people to vote, people turned out and took advantage of those, and we saw more voters participate. And what we saw, unfortunately, in some other places is, in my opinion, a number of states say, based on the political outcome, we don't like what happened. And those states have been going backwards, and it's been very condensed, but it's been very targeted, and it's happened repeatedly across basically every lever they think they can pull for several years now. So there's this huge gulf that's developed, going back to the removal of the Voting Rights Act in 2013. And it just went into hyperdrive the last couple of years with the pandemic and the changes we've seen each year for the last couple of years since then. So it's a vastly different experience on what the registration and voting process is like, especially if you're a new voter trying to participate for the first time. Maybe you've moved across state lines, and even for students who might have voted previously, there's a very good chance that something has changed in the election procedures in their state, even since the last presidential election and even since the midterms in 2022. So, saying all of that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the HEA and then talk specifically about how we've seen some of those issues play out in Ohio in particular before turning it back over. So one of the good things is, you can stay on that one for a second, Chuck. I was just on a tangent, but now I'll do the slides. Thanks, bud. So the HEA has a requirement that's similar to the motor voter, the voter registration law that Diana was mentioning earlier. It's modeled on that, where it basically says that, institutions of higher education have to make this good faith effort to distribute voter registration forms to all of their students physically in attendance. It doesn't have a lot of implementing language around it. It's gone a little bit unnoticed. But we think it is a crucial part of the civic mission of higher ed institutions to actually fulfill that and try and help in a nonpartisan way their students kind of find these on-ramps into our democracy and navigate something like the voter registration process. The U.S. Department of Education put together a really awesome toolkit to help institutions understand and provide some great ideas of things that they could do in a nonpartisan way that would help build these on-ramps for their students and point folks to some existing resources that already exist for this. So part of that was reminding people about this requirement that these institutions have in the HEA, but then giving them a lot of great ideas, both specifically around voter registration, but also other ways to help facilitate voting for the campus community, such as, communicating with your local elections office and seeing if your institution has the facilities to host a voting site for early voting or on election day, or working to recruit people from the campus community to serve as poll workers. There's also some K-12 resources in this toolkit that the department put together as well. And they just released this, so I think some really great stuff in there. We've dropped the website in here so we could share that with folks. One of the other things that they did in here, if you want to go to the next one, we'll talk specifically about federal work study. So hopefully folks on here are familiar with this. I've been getting up to speed on it the last few years, but one of the things that campuses can do based on some guidance from the Department of Education now is actually use federal work study positions to also help do some of this civic engagement work on their campuses. Institutions have always had a requirement that a percentage of their federal work study funds be used for civic engagement and public purpose positions. But specifically in the 2022 Dear Colleague letter that the department put out, they clarified that under this HEA requirement, you could have federal work study positions that were directly with the institution and that those students could engage in voter registration activity. So you could have students who are getting federal work study, maybe they're in a civic engagement office, or maybe they even work at the front desk of the library. but those students could also do voter registration as part of their federal work-study positions if they were employed with the institution. And then when this 2024 material was being prepared, this most recent Dear Colleague letter around the HEA requirement and putting out this toolkit to help institutions navigate nonpartisan ways that they could help their students kind of join our democracy ahead of elections this year, they further clarified that federal work-study positions that were with a federal, state, local, or tribal government or agency could also engage in civic engagement work. So this could include things like supporting broad-based get out the vote activities, again, voter registration, providing voter assistance, working at a polling place, working with their Secretary of State's office or a local elections office to do this type of work. Currently, the department's analysis of their statutes and their rulemaking processes that they've gone through, federal work-study positions that are with like an outside nonprofit cannot engage in these kind of similar activities, including voter registration. But if the position is directly with the institution or with one of these government agencies, then that is an acceptable way that you can use federal work-study funds. So one of the things that we did with some of our other partners that we do this work with, the great folks over at the Students Learn Students Vote Coalition and the All in Campus Democracy Challenge, is actually talk to a bunch of campuses that we know have used federal work-study positions for different civic engagement activities in the past, including specifically to do this type of work. So we put together this toolkit that has a bunch of additional resources, example materials, kind of feedback and lessons learned from talking to a number of those institutions to try and make it as easy as possible for folks to follow this guidance and be able to implement these types of positions on your campus. So you can see the link there if you want to access the toolkit is sls.vote/federalworks-fsw-2024. And I'll drop that in the chat a little bit later, but wanted to make sure that I shared that with folks. Okay, so I'm going to zoom into Ohio, but it's going to tie back around to why I just spent the last couple of minutes talking about the HEA and federal work study. So I wanted to share this. This is following the 2020 election. You can see here in this picture from this New York Times article, they called through and talked to a number of election officials, and even in the headline photo, they was Frank LaRose, who is the Ohio Secretary of State from 21 and ran in 2018, won re-election in 2022. And you can see here that he basically said that there wasn't any evidence of voter fraud right after the election. He was responsible for running this election as the Secretary of State in Ohio. He thought that he had done a good job at the time. He has this quote here about how people have the capacity for inventing things, and there's conspiracy theories that come up around these, but that we didn't have those types of problems in the 2020 election in Ohio. And then things changed. So I wanted to kind of dig in some here, and there's a lot on this slide, so I'll talk through a little bit of it. But one of the things that has happened in Ohio in the last couple of years is that they have just been under some incredible gerrymandering, both at the state legislative level and the federal congressional level. So much so that there was a move and an initiative put on the ballot in 2018 to prevent extreme partisan gerrymandering that was passed overwhelmingly, I think by like 75+% of the vote. This constitutional amendment to ban this extreme partisan gerrymandering passed. Unfortunately, one of the things that happened is that it made a redistricting committee that was made up entirely of elected officials, and it was dominated by one party. So after the 2020 census, that redistricting commission submitted maps 7 different times that were struck down as unconstitutional by the state Supreme Court. And what the commission kept doing was just adopting the same maps again and again until they functionally ran out the clock on the courts and elections were held with these unconstitutional maps for both the state legislature and for the congressional districts. One of the things we saw in 2020 is I think the Republican presidential candidate got 54% of the vote, yet Republican congressional candidates were able to capture 66% or more of the congressional seats. There's a majority of one party in both chambers of the House. And one of the things that we saw once they got these gerrymandered maps, as they said about just in the last few years, even since the 2023 election, so even since the last midterms, We've seen them go on a very aggressive effort to restrict people's access to voting now that they've gerrymandered themselves into a one-party majority. So they've done things to remove access to voting, like remove the final day of in-person voting. They shorten the time that you can request an absentee ballot by 4 days, and they reduce the time that mailed ballots have to arrive if they're postmarked by the election by 6 days. Each county, also regardless by size, may only provide one ballot drop box at the county election office, which is a big difference when you've got, a place like Cuyahoga County that serves, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of voters compared to many of the more smaller rural counties that may only serve tens of thousands or or fewer voters. It's silly. We've also seen that, the Secretary of State used to be an advocate for, is publicly on the record saying how great this process called ERIC is. ERIC is an interstate compact that until just a few years ago, the vast majority of states across the country participated in. And what they did was they would collect things like the National Postal Service and MOVE file, the Social Security's death database, as well as data provided directly to them by all of the participating states. And they would be able to use that with other commercially available data to try and do these matches to figure out if voters had moved across state lines. And they would provide that information to states so that they could try and remove people off their rolls who no longer lived in their state, and also reach out to people that might have moved into their state that needed to be registered to vote who were registered somewhere else. The Secretary of State just recently after the 2022 election removed Ohio from this interstate match process, and now instead, without this good cross-state data to rely on, is now going through their own voter approach process and just produced a list. Now that here we are, 100 some days away from the election, of 160,000 voters who may be purged this year by their local counties. We also saw, I think, one of the wildest things is that, Ohio, without any, again, evidence of voter fraud being put forward in an election that was run by the Secretary of State himself, has now adopted one of the strictest photo voter ID laws in the country. They join just a handful of other states that have an incredibly limited list of only photo IDs that can now be used to vote. And if you do not have one of the specific IDs requested, your vote will not be counted. And this included removing the only form of photo ID that was specifically available to student voters. You used to be able to use a utility bill and even kind of a letter specifically from your institution if you lived on campus saying that you do not owe any money, as kind of like a replacement for a utility bill for on-campus students. And that form of ID was removed without any evidence that there was any fraud being committed with it. So the last thing I'll share here, and then we can take Caleb's question, is just that, seeing that we've seen this crazy gerrymandering, see that the legislature has pursued all these ways to now remove access to voting now that they've got this majority. We've also seen citizens turn to ballot measures to try and address these issues. They've been putting a number of issues that they're concerned about directly on the ballot since this happened. And one of the ways that we actually saw them respond to that is the legislature tried to put forward a constitutional amendment that would actually raise the threshold for future amendments from a simple majority to a 60% voter threshold, or a supermajority threshold. That ballot initiative was defeated. Some other ballot initiatives have been passed in the last few years. And this year, there's a ballot initiative that has submitted its signatures and has succeeded enough signatures. So now they just need to go through the actual language process to get on the ballot. But they would replace the current redistricting commission, which, as I mentioned, is made up entirely of elected officials, with a citizen redistricting commission. So that going forward, we would have a citizen-based process, and it would remove these self-interested individuals from doing what they did last time, which is just continue to pass their own maps until they can have elections underneath these unconstitutional maps. So why don't I stop there for a second? And I know there was a question before.
Yeah, so my question was about voter purges. So I was wondering specifically if people moved from county to county, whether or not they would also be purged since they were not probably being tracked when they moved.
So I would say, I think there's two different things. Every election jurisdiction at the county and even the state level engages in kind of like voter list maintenance. And I think the difference between kind of like good list maintenance practices and voter purges are when folks are using high quality data that produces highly likely matches, and then also doing like a notification period. So like under some federal statutes, most folks, like if someone doesn't vote for multiple elections in a row, you send them a notice, and then if they do not respond and they do not show up to election, they become an inactive person and eventually get removed from the rolls. And the difference in the things that I would describe as voter purges is, like despite not being a majority of the population in Ohio, the vast majority of the people on this list that the Secretary of State has produced that might be purged this year are all folks who live in counties that are predominantly people of color. We see, I think, when we think about voter purges, as folks not using good data sources to try and create these lists, not having good processes for notifying voters before they're removed from the ballot, doing something in an election year a couple months before in a major election, I don't think is a good way to do voter list maintenance. That might have been a longer answer to than the question you asked, Caleb, but does that help?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. I think maybe one of the other things to note too is that a number of states have like a fail-safe process where if someone was already on the rolls previously, but then they do move, it's easier to transfer your registration or even potentially vote at a prior address or only vote on statewide races, depending on what kind of fail-safe processes they have in place. Whereas like if someone has never registered or they get purged from the rolls, then those backup processes then are no longer available to them. Okay, I want to make sure I have enough time to turn it back to Diana to talk about Florida. So if folks have other questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or I can get some at the end. But one of the other things I would note too here is that, similarly, one of the things that came to our attention is that earlier this year, the Attorney General sent out a letter to all of the institutions of higher education in Ohio, talking, basically dissuading them, trying to scare them into thinking that they could not use their federal work-study funds in compliance with the Department of Education's guidance on these, doing things under like the HEA, like doing voter registration. He closed his letter, as you can see here. The last paragraph is a very threatening paragraph that talks about the penalties and fines for violating federal law. So we felt the need with some of our partners in Ohio to write a memo back and provide some more accurate information and combat some of this, I think, misinformation and disinformation from the Attorney General themselves. To note that the Department of Education goes through its own rulemaking process and produces guidance based on statutes that it's responsible for. And the Attorney General does not have the authority to enforce federal law in the state, and that the things that he said about the federal guidance are outside his purview. So I just, I think we've seen this kind of across the board effort here, where once a political party has gained power in a state through extreme gerrymandering, they then try and remove access to voting. They've done several things that have specifically tried to influence higher education, to chill them from doing even nonpartisan things to assist their students in being able to understand the democratic process, learn how to engage in our democracy, create these on-ramps that I think we should be actually structurally building in to welcome each new generation of voters into the process. And that is one of the things that we're trying to do in this work by following these things, is to understand when this comes up and provide folks with accurate information that helps them combat these issues and navigate these laws so that we can hopefully see better outcomes in the future. So I think that's what I've got on the Ohio case, unless there is any other questions or follow-up kind of about what's been going on in Ohio and how we see them trying to respond to some of these efforts to limit people's ability to register and vote.
Awesome. Well, so I will spend the next few minutes just talking about third party voter registration laws. And we wanted to use Florida as kind of the case example for that. I hadn't So I am new to this space of tracking state voter access legislation. I think we started at NASPA tracking this legislation in 2022, largely due to kind of the strong connections, of course, that we saw with efforts to restrict voting access and other efforts to restrict access to equitable options for higher for folks to enter institutions of higher education and for students to succeed. And so I was realizing more recently that it's possible that these third-party voter registration laws have been around for a while. I'm not sure, but I only started seeing them this past year, or in the last few years. And we've seen especially restrictive legislation enacted in Florida, and then we've seen some kind of corresponding litigation come out from that. But I did want to share in the chat, the Movement Advancement Project recently launched, if you have not seen, a series of these democracy maps on like a number of issue areas, and they have one on third-party voter registration drive legislation. And so this is legislation where restrictions include requiring groups to register or complete training through the state, as well as implementing deadlines which require completed applications to be returned before the general registration deadline. So this can create a chilling effect for grassroots organizations and also for institutions of higher education. And I would definitely love to hear more from our experts with the Fair Election Center in more detail about these laws as well. But in the case from Florida, which is an interesting one, so there was a law enacted in 2023, SB 7050, that did a couple of things. So one of the things was require third-party voter registration groups that employ non-citizen volunteers they would be subject to a $50,000 fine for each non-citizen volunteer, even those with green cards. So that has actually been combated in the courts. And last month, a couple months ago, a federal judge ruled that it was unconstitutional for Florida to ban non-citizens from registering people to vote, luckily. But we've also seen another part of this law, which is fining groups as much as $2,500 for each voter registration application that is turned in late. And there are fines for turning in forms to the incorrect county, where annual fines could reach the cap for what an organization can be fined is $250,000. And so for, a small grassroots organization, this could be the entire civic engagement or voter registration kind of budget for that organization. And I saw different statistics. I saw that an organizing manager with Black Votes Matter advocacy group in Florida report that 70% of their 110 grassroots organizations that they were training decided to no longer conduct the voter registration drives. And so it's had, like I said, this massive chilling effect. The League of Women Voters of Florida decided instead to stop registering voters using paper applications and instead have been directing voters to scan a QR code with a smartphone and register on their own. So this has been creating widespread impacts in Florida, as you can imagine. And I was really surprised when I saw the Movement Advancement Project indicate that there were 23 states that have some kind of restrictions on third-party organizations and conducting voter registration drives. That's, half of the states. So that's all I'll go into on Florida. I'm looking at the time. If folks have questions, we are here to answer them. And I can also put my email in the chat for folks. Yes, Mike, thank you for sharing the toolkit also. Folks have questions, thoughts, comments? Where do we go from here?
All right, if there is no other questions, I would like to just give a round of applause and thanks to both of our speakers. And if you have any further questions, you can always reach out to any of us. But again, I'll put the Voter Friendly Campus email in here. And we look forward to seeing all of you back in August. Thank you.
Thanks.